This lesson is going to be about the periodic table, and the goal of this lesson, the learning target, is to know the features on the periodic table, like the groups and periods, and to be able to find elements on the periodic table. So remember that the periodic table tells us some specific information about our elements. We have the atomic number, which is the number of protons in that element. We have the element symbol, which is basically an abbreviation. It's just a quicker way of noting that element. We've got the name, and we've got the atomic mass. And remember that this atomic mass right here is the average, the weighted average actually, of all the different isotopes, the naturally occurring isotopes of that element. And so if we were going to try to find the mass number, we would round this to 12 and we would use that. Remember, our atomic number is the number of protons. Now, each periodic table might be different. They might not all have this information, but these are some of the things that would show up on a periodic table. And so you should have a periodic table in front of you. The point of this video is to, by the end of it, have a periodic table that is labeled and shaded and colored and whatever else you want to do with it to make it work for you. And so please have a periodic table out in front of you for this video. So the first thing that we want to note on our periodic table is the periods and groups. We have 7 periods, which are the horizontal rows going across our periodic table. I'm just going to draw, sorry, I had a picture of a periodic table on this slide, but it must not have come over. There's kind of a periodic table. So our periods are going to be our horizontal rows that go along this periodic table. There is no curved dips in our periodic table. These are our periods. They go across the periodic table. And so I have period 1, period 2, period 3, period 4, period 5, period 6, and you're going to be labeling these in the next slide. I'll show you a picture of how that works. And I also have 18 groups, which are the vertical columns, which elements have similar properties. That's an important part of the periodic table, is that the columns have similar properties. And so I have my groups are running up and down this way, like that. There's 8 major groups, and you can see this little blocky part here. These are called the transition metals, and that's a different block of the elements. We're going to ignore those with our 1A to 8A as we label those. But just so you know that, remember, the periods are the horizontal rows, the groups or families are the vertical columns. And so here's a lot better picture of a periodic table. This is what I wanted to show you. On your periodic table, you should have one that looks like this. You should label groups and number the 8 major groups. You can see right there, 1, 2, 3, those numbers going across our families. And then you should also label the periods and write the name periods on that side of your periodic table so that you remember that those rows are the periods. And so period 2 would go across here, period 3 goes across here, period 4 goes all the way across here. And the opposite is true with our rows, or our groups, where our group 8 is this one right here, the noble gases. So go ahead and do that to your periodic table. Now there are some other elements on the periodic table, some different parts of the periodic table that we're not going to cover a ton. They don't matter for a lot of the things that we're doing. This is a physical science class, an introduction to physical science class, and so dealing with the transition metals, the lanthanides and actinides, and what's different about their electrons and their atoms isn't something that we're really going to cover in here, but I do want you to know where they are and have them labeled on your periodic table. So our transition metals, again, are this little block right here in the middle part. That's why this group is labeled 3, but this is 3A, which is really what we're going to be worrying about. Excuse me. Your lanthanides and your actinides would actually insert right here. This line would be here, and this part, this whole section would shift way down. But in order to make the periodic table fit on a nice wall poster, we had to pull them out and leave them down here. There's probably other reasons for that, but it helps a lot for the wall posters too. So go ahead and add in the transition metals label into your periodic table, showing this middle block of elements. And your periodic table, the lanthanide series and the actinide series are already pulled out and labeled for you, so you don't have to worry about those. So the next part is knowing where our metals, our nonmetals, and our metalloids are. On this periodic table, I've labeled them as blue, yellow, and pink for our metals, nonmetals, and our metalloids. Notice that our metals are typically over here on the left-hand side. You can see this little oddball here. That's important to remember that hydrogen is a non-metal. Hydrogen is kind of a funky atom. Remember that I said that the columns have similar properties in their groups, in their families, up and down their columns. Hydrogen will sometimes act like this family, and sometimes it'll act like a misfit and act like this family. They couldn't decide what to do with it, so it ended up right here. More often than not, it acts like this one, but sometimes it'll act like this one. So hydrogen is obviously a nonmetal. You'll label that in your periodic table. Noticing that we have some metalloids here. There's we call this the staircase. If you hear that a little bit later, that's what we're talking about here. This kind of jagged line that goes through a periodic table separating the metals from the metals. They have properties of both the metals and nonmetals, and so we call them metalloids. So go ahead and highlight the metals, nonmetals, and metalloids, either outline or to completely highlight them and make a key of what you're doing here. The reasoning for mine is I put blue for my metals, I put yellow for my nonmetals, and I put green as kind of a mixture of the two of them in between for our metalloids. So label those however you see fit, either with a highlighter. I would not shade over the entire thing with a colored pencil. That might be kind of difficult to see through because obviously there are little numbers and labels here that you're going to want to be able to see, but if you do it lightly, that would probably work okay. Just make sure that you can read your periodic table and know what is a metal and what's a non-metal. And so just some information about our metals. They're on the left-hand side of the staircase. They're good conductors of heat and electricity. They're malleable. They can be handled in thin sheets. They're ductile and can be pulled into wires. You've seen this before. They're lustrous, and an example of them is gold. And so those are some of the properties of our metals. They're fairly similar throughout the metal group. Our nonmetals are found on the right hand of the side of the staircase. They have low boiling points, they're brittle, they're dull, and they're good insulators. They're essentially the opposite of our metals. An example of this would be sulfur. So these ones over here will have more of these type of properties. And you can see that some of them are gases at room temperature, and you can also label those onto your periodic table. We're not going to be going through which ones are gases at room temperatures, but you can tell that nitrogen, oxygen, fluorine, chlorine, bromine, and I believe iodine. Bromine might be a liquid at room temperature. And then all of our noble gases, which we'll label later. So we've got our nonmetals there. You can also see the metalloids are found along the staircase. That's the green ones that I labeled in mine. Whatever you labeled them with, they have properties of metals, and nonmetals tend to be good semiconductors in transistors. Very, very, very important. Silicon Valley, the transistors that you build a lot of computers, technology, and such like that. So metalloids do have a purpose. They are very important. So there's some special names in our periodic table. We have the group 1, the 1A, are the alkali metals. They're soft metals that are extremely reactive. You've probably heard of sodium before. You put it in water, it's going to light on fire, blow up. A lot of people have heard of that one. We have group 2, which is the alkaline earth metals, shiny reactive metals. We have our halogens, which are extremely reactive nonmetals. And we have our noble gases, which are inert or unreactive gases. They do not react. We'll get into why that is. They have a full outer shell of electrons. But these groups of elements have certain properties that are very special. So we give them a name. So I would like you to add in those 4 groups with the special names. We have the alkali metals, we have the alkaline earth metals, we have our halogens over here, and we have our noble gases on the end. Just to remember what those names are for those elements. So now we're going to play a little game of Find That Element. On Edpuzzle, I'm going to be sending you some questions that have some clues to different elements, and we're going to be finding out if you can use your periodic table to be able to find the elements that I'm pointing you towards. So I hope that this video has helped you to get your periodic table labeled and drawn out and to understand some of the different features of your periodic table so that you can find elements on here. So let's give it a shot.